There are a lot of units and heroes from Warcraft 3 that never got a proper representation in World of Warcraft. Or, as we've seen with witch doctors and necromancers, their abilities get poached by other classes. And then, people who only ever played World of Warcraft argue, oh, we don't need this class because we already have this completely different class that stole some of their core abilities. And like, I'm not against people who only ever played WoW. It's been over 20 years after all. People who played Warcraft 3 are only ever going to get more and more rare, so it's fine if you haven't played the RTS. You still should, because it's still a great game, but I don't blame you if you don't. However, the game will need more PC classes eventually, and you have to get their concepts somewhere. And you could make them up from scratch, like evokers. But I do believe it's important to get those classes to loop back to some already existing ideas, be they from Warcraft 3 or from earlier expansions. And while I do have some very original class concepts, I don't want to go full fanfiction in these. I want to give you class concepts that are based on prior precedent, and today we are going to delve into a class concept that is a very unique idea, not represented in WoW yet, that is based on prior lore. And the class today is the Spellbreaker. The Spellbreaker was not a hero unit in Warcraft 3, but it was one of the more striking and unique units to come out of the game. The game definitely did not shy away from letting you play some really weird things. Playing the Scourge, you would have a lot of weird monsters you'd play with. Gargoyles and crypt fiends and abominations. Man, you could make a whole class out of abominations. But they are not the topic today. In the other factions, maybe the units didn't look as weird, but the designers definitely had unique ideas for what the units could do with magic, or with denying magic. My last video was about how fantasy writers, be it for books or games, frequently do not really use the potential of what magic can do to make warfare different. However, while Warcraft 3 didn't have weather magic or terrain manipulation, the designers did have unique ideas for what to do with individual units. And one of the more unique units, one of my favorite units in the human faction, was the Spellbreaker. And it's not just because I have been well documented liking characters who steal crap from others, but because it's about countering magic. This unit actually remembers it's in a fantasy universe, and it interacts with that concept. Have people watching this watched the Lucifer TV show? For like the first 2 seasons, it's virtually tangential, one of those. It's virtually tangential that the main character is the devil. Like, sure, he does his mojo where he makes people say what they truly desire, but most of the show is just a random crime procedural with misplaced raunchy jokes. And then there was one episode in those seasons where Lucifer befriends a priest. Then, spoiler alert, the priest dies, and like for one episode it matters that he is Lucifer. And that was my favorite episode at the time. Sure, the show gets better later and it actually becomes about Lucifer, but do you get what I mean? The Spellbreaker ticks the same box for me. It makes it matter that we are in a fantasy universe with magic, because it specifically works with it and against it. But now that we know why the Spellbreaker is necessary and why it's a unique class that brings something new to the table, what would it look like in World of Warcraft? If we look at the armor they traditionally wore, it looks more on the heavy side, but not exactly plate, so I would put them in male. And we are at a dearth of male classes, and I'd give them most melee weapons, including warglaives, because look at this thing, and of course, shields. Though the primary attributes don't really matter as much these days, I'd imagine they primarily go for intellect and agility for different specializations. As for the resource, I'd probably just give them mana, because we don't really need a different resource for every class. WoW itself does seem to disagree with me, so if you have to have a unique resource for Spellbreakers, make it a power siphon, and make it so they have to hit people with something to steal their resource to get any of theirs, encouraging a more active, forceful play that reflects the ideas behind the class. Now the next step we need is in the class design is the specializations that are often the key to the class fantasy. Unlike many of the classes we have gone over before, there is really only one source of abilities and identity for the spellbreaker, the actual spellbreaker from WarCraft 3. So that is a small problem because we have to start making things up. We've always been making some things up in this series, but we are getting into the territory where we will really have to start to expand. I try not to get too much into that, but I do believe the Spellbreaker has the conceptual space to make it forgivable. And I hope you forgive me for going a little bit into fanfiction. The first specialization is based on the classical Spellbreaker still. I call him the Spell Thief. And this guy is mostly a support specialization. While augmentation evokers are still a little bit controversial because they did cause some issues for psychological reasons, more so than the game design, but I do believe there is a space for these. Spell Thief focuses on the spell steal ability, which ironically has been stolen by mages in WoW. Okay, the thing with spell steal is, to the best of my knowledge, it's barely usable in modern WoW. The devs either just don't bother to mark enemy buffs and spells as spell stealable, or they think players stealing NPC abilities are too dangerous. Also, the WoW mage spell steal has always been a little bit jank, in that either the mobs don't have any buffs to steal, or they have multiple and you get random, not necessarily useful. Okay, so here is my solution for this. How the Spellbreaker's spell steal differs from the mage's spell steal. The Spellbreaker, especially the Spell Thief spec, gets a selection of spell steal slots. Like, they can drag multiple copies of spell steal into their bar, and when you use one instance of spell steal, you get a pop-up or a menu or some graphical representation of a few things you can steal. And once you choose that spell steal slot gets filled with that spell, perhaps slightly nerfed numerically or losing some secondary effects to balance it better, and for a short amount of time that you can probably prolong with talents and other spells, you keep that spell in that slot. And when that time expires, the spell returns into an instance of spell steal. Yes, it's basically Sketch from the Smeargle Pokemon. This Spellbreaker is Smeargle. This variation of spell steal would necessitate some changes in actual WoW game design. First off, the devs would need to remember to switch spell stealable on NPC abilities. Secondly, they need to consider the NPC abilities and what they do if a player steals it, and consider what gets nerfed, potentially, when the Spellbreaker steals it. Which does sound like a lot of work, but it's hardly something extraordinary for a new player class. You have to always consider beasts you drop in the game because the hunters will want to tame them. You have to always consider demons, which warlocks will enslave, or even humanoids that can get mind-controlled by priests. I don't think it's too much work for a PC class, but it would require some game design philosophy changes. It would require the devs to be less afraid of what the player can do to have fun, and instead, just let them have fun, which Blizzard has been admittedly struggling with. So, this support Spell Thief could steal enemy buffs and apply them not only to themselves but to their allies as well. Of course, on top of the standard spells they would always get to not have to depend on enemies with applicable buffs, as well as offensive debuffs, slowing down enemy casting speed, for example. This support spec works by giving their allies the benefits their enemies normally get, and shifting the scales this way. The second specialization is still based on that original unit, but on a different aspect of it. The Spellbreaker's attacks could sap enemy mana and make spellcasters be less useful. And in WoW, the resource bars on enemies are either just cosmetic, and they can keep casting without any mana somehow, or they are so crucial to encounters you'd basically break them by sapping that resource. However, we don't need to copy this ability exactly. We can just focus on the spirit of it, and that is the tank specialization I call the Nullifier. The Nullifier Spellbreaker focuses less on stealing the spells and more on negating enemy abilities. Just like how Prot Paladins can keep interrupting and silencing everything around them, the nullifier can interrupt constantly or spread silence or disarm or other debilitating effects. And of course, when you get interrupted or silenced, you get angry. More angry than if you were attacked. Because technically you can act, but you can't really do anything. So all the nullification creates a lot of threat, which is how the nullifier tanks. By annoying people, by making them unable to act, and by stealing debuffs from their allies and putting them back on their enemies. The final specialization is where I have to get a little bit of fanfiction, and I call it the Arcane Trickster, after the very popular Rogue subclass in D&D. The Arcane Trickster is a DPS spec, which prefers to go into melee dual wielding, and though they do their fair share of attacking with weapons and spells, they still steal some spells and buffs from their enemies, and still get a lot of interrupts and barriers. They do just in tandem with more rogue-style quick melee combat. Now, like all modern WoW classes, the Spellbreaker needs hero talents. And as was the case with some classes we've gone over before, there is little lore precedent for these because it's basically all based on one unit. So we have to get creative and imagine what kind of grander, more creative identities can emerge between the specializations we established. And there are still some cool and unique and not entirely unfounded specialization we can make here. The first one lies between the Spell Thief and the Nullifier is what I am tentatively calling the Spell Filcher, after ethereal spell filters. Yes, it sounds a lot like Spell Thief, which is why I'm not 100% sold on this name yet, but it's the best idea I had so far, okay? The Spell Filcher focuses on ability from WoW actually, and it was an ability from Mists of Pandaria that I really loved, but it has been gone for a long time, and that was a druid ability called Symbiosis. And man, if you have not played at the time, I love Symbiosis. It was an ability that allowed you to copy a spell from another person's class, or a variant of it, and they would get one of your druid spells in return. And I just loved the fantasy of it. It was unfortunately, allegedly very buggy code-wise and causing a lot of problems, or it was very hard to balance. The verdict is uncertain, but I'd love it to return in some form. Perhaps if it's on the spell filter, it's not symbiosis, and you're not giving anything back, you just steal something from your ally. And the hero talents would be all about assisting, merging that stolen spell with your parent specialization, which would probably be a lot of work to balance, or to design all the options, but it would be very fun to play with if it could be done. The second hero talent between the Arcane Trickster and the Spell Thief that I had in mind is what I'm calling the Binder, and it still focuses on one of the key identities of the Spellbreaker, something that even the base Spellbreaker would be able to do, but the Binder would get a lot more focus on it. Namely, the Binder steals your pets. In WarCraft 3, they were stealing summons, but if they did that in WoW, they'd have to be used just for PvP and just against certain classes. So the Binder instead gets a little bit of mind control on any outsider type of enemy. That is, demons, undead, aberrations, and if they ever get introduced in WoW as creature types, angels and celestials and so on. The Binder can grab some enemies, and while all Spellbreakers can do that to some degree, the Binder gets a few slots of enemies he can call on and resummon himself. It's not like a hunter's stable where they get to keep 5 billion different beasts. It's just a very short list of specific enemies you can keep on your bar, and which you have to replace when you get a new one. The final hero talent between Arcane Trickster and Nullifier is again the more fan-fiction element, and I'm right now calling it the Soul Killer. And perhaps this hero talent can do a little bit of that resource damage, perhaps they can really focus on debuffs by imparting harmful conditions on their enemies, so that either the Arcane Trickster weakens the enemies for their allies and themselves, or the Nullifier prevents the enemies from hurting their allies. Though this is admittedly the least developed of these ideas here. And the last question left here is the races it could be. And because it's all based on one unit, the prior precedent is basically just Blood Elves. But there's no reason to believe other races couldn't have developed similar disciplines that we just haven't seen before. It's again going a bit more fanfiction here, but These days, almost every base class can be taken up by any race, so one can presume that would also be true here, and maybe would just be trained by Void Elf and Blood Elf spellbreakers. Well, I think I have gone through most of my unique ideas for the Spellbreaker as a World of Warcraft class, and I do think WoW would benefit greatly for a class, especially focused on anti-magic, not just because of making the magic in the world more important by interacting with it, but also by giving us a different and more unique playstyle. I am starting to get into a little more lore sparse territory. The last poll choices, because these were decided by a poll, so keep an eye on the channel, were besides the Spellbreaker, a Primal and an Inscriber. Both classes from the old WoW TTRPG, one of them with more video game precedent than the other. Once I run out of even these, I still have a bunch of classes that I pretty much completely made up, but still lore friendly. I'm not sure you'd want to see videos about those. Like, one idea is Void Reaver, another idea is Blackguard, which are basically like a heavy armored Void class and a heavily armored Fel-based class, which they are based on lore ideas, but there's a lot of original content there. So I'm not sure if you'd want to see the videos about those. If you do let me know, but I think I might be ending before that point, and find a different topic to overanalyze in World of Warcraft, or somewhere else. But this will be it for now, and I hope to see you next time.